All right, good day. Today we're going to look at the domination, the imperial conquest of the two main countries or nations that would become countries on the continent of India, or the continent of Asia, that is India and China. We will mention a few of the smaller countries that are there as well, but we're going to look at mainly how did the European and to a certain extent American mindset of imperialism and trade and capitalism, how did that lead to what we know of as a modern day situations in those countries of India and China? If you have your books, they're page 290. Now, there was a company that it should be very familiar to you if you've watched the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, and one of that is the East India Company, the British East India Company. Now, there was a British West India Company that went and dealt with trade and things like that on the islands near America, the Bahamas and the Caribbean area there. Those were called the West Indies. This here are the East Indies. And so they had this, and they had extensive trade relations with different states in what would become the country of India. Now, a little side note, India today is actually made up of many, many former kingdoms, nations, people groups, and language groups that after the British rule came in, crammed them all together and called them India, is what developed there. And Britain, when they went through and were trying to colonize different areas here, it came to a certain extent where France and England were once again at war. All the way back in the 1750s, they had what would become known as the Seven Years' War. Now, we know this war as the French and Indian War. Technically speaking, the Seven Years' War went for 9 years, but that's because it was fought for 2 years in the Americas first, and then later 7 more years in the surrounding world in the areas there, mainly between France and England, and some of their allies would be involved as well. But they went through and fought that. And so they went through and they had the 7 Years' War. The French lose the war and they lose some major holdings in England or in the England colonies and in the new colonies of the New World there. There also was battles that took place on the subcontinent, sometimes it's called, of India. And this took place here where the British defeated a French supported Indian force, an Indian army. They were completely destroyed, broke the control and the strength that India or that France had over India, and opened the door for within 3 years that France was completely defeated and kicked out of the country of India. And the British move in and take over. Now, when the British were there were some good consequences and some bad consequences of the conquest. Depending on if you were British or if you were a native Indian of the country there, depends on whether it was good or not and how you looked at it. The British did come through, and they most of the time had very little care or concern for the culture of the people of the groups that they took over. Most of the time, unlike the French would come in and they would assimilate, they would learn some of the customs. Many times they would intermarry and learn the language, different things like that, and become very useful allies with the natives that were there. We see the British kind of do the opposite. They go in and some may learn the language, some may intermarry, but as an entire idea of colonial mindset, they were there to Europeanize and civilize in their mindsets, in their minds, the people of these different areas that they conquer. And so they saw them as uncivilized. They saw it again as this kind of racist view that it's the white man's burden to help bring civilization to these backwards individuals that are there. And so they went through and they did that again in India. They took over there. Now, eventually, there was a lot of major strife that developed there. And so it took place where even the Queen of England had to step in and say, this is a place of non-interference, meaning that we are going to go in there and we will rule them, but we are going to do as little as we can to change their culture. Because she began to realize, especially in an area like modern-day India, there were too many uh, difficult and dangerous things that could happen if they tried to Europeanize or Englishize, if that's a word, these people here. And so what began there was the conquest and the control of India. If you have your books, page 292 shows a very good map that shows that Britain did not have control of the entire subcontinent. There was the area there, the green, that was controlled mostly by the British, and the orange that was controlled by French, or not French, I'm sorry, by native Indian peoples, by their own leaders and things like that, their own maybe warlords, maybe emperors, maybe kings. It depends on how they looked at there. But they were easily allied with the British, or they were taken over by the British. And so you can see all these different places here. These are actually very representative, and even more detail to go into this, that they were different people groups controlling in this different area there. Well, as they go through and conquer, the East India Company takes over in 1773, and or they get taken over by the by the British government. The government seizes control, and the government begins to spread the control and the power. The East India Company was made to help with trade and just ruling things like that, but they had almost gone bankrupt. They had a lot of corruption was in there, so the government takes over. Well, when that happens, eventually we have in the mid 1800s a problem. In 1814, a Charter Act went and gave the British Crown direct control. In the American colonies, we would have called these a royal colony, where the British Crown has direct control, gets the direct resources and tax revenue from that. And so all of India goes directly under the Crown and is controlled in that way. Well, the problem was the way that the British did things is they would go in and they were very sneaky with how they controlled different places. At its peak, there were probably 1,000 governmental ruling officials in India of British origin, meaning that in the entire, what we call today the subcontinent of India, was ruled by 1,000 people, yeah, by governors or mayors or lords or whatever, not kings. I mean, there was one king, the King of England or the Queen of England, that they have there, but 1,000 people ruled over it. Now, that's not including merchants or people that lived there or soldiers. There was many, many people from Britain and different places there that were in India, but mostly the rulers, there's about 1,000, and they ruled many dozens of millions, like almost 30 million people with a disc. Well, the way they did that was they would go in and they would set up their rulers. The most often would be native Indians would be set up, and they would do what the British told them to do. The British would offer them support, and if the ruler did not do what the British wanted them to do, either they were removed, or if they were attacked by an enemy, the British would just let it happen. And so they went through and controlled there. Well, eventually it came to a point where they started Europeanizing, making these people more and more British, and they would do that by creating military units from the native population. And these were called sepoys. That was the name that they were given, the sepoys there. Well, something happened that drastically changed how Britain interacted with their colonies here in India. And that was something that was the Sepoy Mutiny or the Sepoy Rebellion, I've also heard it called. This became a big problem because the sepoys were of two major religious groups. There were Muslims and there were also Hindus. And the way things worked with the weaponry that they used, the rifles, the muskets that they used, they were called cartridges. Now, a cartridge was a piece of paper, like a tube of paper about this big, and it would have a gunpowder, some gunpowder in it. It would have the musket ball or the rifle shot that was in there. And it would be tied or twisted on both ends. And then to keep it waterproof, rumored was that they used either cow fat that was boiled down or pig fat that was boiled down and almost as like a wax substance, put it on the outside to make sure the cartridges didn't get wet just by sitting out. Well, the problem was when your two major religious groups that are part of your military are Hindu and Muslim, the rumors of using beef and pork remnants or remains is a big problem. For the Muslims, they will quite literally, in their mind, according to the religion, it is a major taboo to deal with pork. To the extent that if you touch pork, I've heard, some type of pork product, some type of pig product, and then you don't get that taken care of, and then you die, you go to hell, is what the Muslims said. So if you're in battle, and the way that they would most often, they weren't allowed to eat pork, different things there. And so the way that you would do these cartridges in battle is after you fire, your weapon, you would then hold the weapon, pull a cartridge out, and rip the end of the paper off with your teeth. Pour the stuff in, use the ramrod to go do it, and then you would fire. Well, they considered that if it was pork that was on it, they considered that as eating it, or at least it was in their mouth. They would ingest some of it, just they had to. And so the Muslims wouldn't do that because you're in battle. The chances of touching a pork product and then dying are go up exponentially when you're being shot at. Then you also have the other side, the other large religious group that was part of the British military there, that was the Hindus. And to them, cows were a sacred animal to their religion, worshipped even, cherished, and revered. And so if the British are using beef products, they are now touching the dead sacred animal to their religion, which is again is a major deal. And so they revolted. Eventually, when the rumors get around that the cartridges are made this way and the British officers tell them to load their rifles, the soldiers refuse. Well, when that happens, the British would then strip them of their uniforms, they would demote them, they would not let them continue, they would punish them. Eventually, this spread of the British actions of really humiliating these different officers and soldiers, people began to revolt. But before the British could fully contain the situation, both sides had massacred innocent people. Wrong and wickedness had happened on both sides of this. Finally, within a year, they went and got control, and that's when Queen Victoria said, "You know what? I'm stepping in. This is how it's going to be. The crown is going to take control of this." And so she went there and did that, and said that the Indian people had a right to their own government. They had a voice in their government. But at the same time, the Indian people had a right to their own government, so they started setting up these puppet governments that the British could control. But the British would not allow the Indian people to have a say in the British government. So it was absorbed into the British Empire, and they got a lot of wealth from the empire, for the empire from India. They call it the crown jewel of their empire. They would get cotton, they would get rice, they would get all sorts of resources from India, and for a long time, all the way up to World War One, they would control parts of this. And the biggest one that would be the most successful, that would generate the most money, would be a plant called the poppy seed or the poppy plant, and from it was derived something as opium. Now today you have opium plant or these poppy plants. You have opium fields that are there that are still made. You can also create heroin for those from those plants as well if it's refined properly. But opium was a plant, or sorry, was a drug that they would use there, and it became known that in China, opium was loved. Opium was very, very addictive. Think of it as any type of drug, illicit drug that people would use today to get a high, to make them feel relaxed. And now it's not one you didn't see people going out and most of the time doing large amounts of damage or violence when they were on this drug. Usually, if they were on this drug, they would just lounge around. They would just lay there in a dazed state. But it was highly, highly addictive, is what people would do there. And so eventually, the British Empire realized, they really like this there in China. So they grew the poppy seeds, they developed the opium in India, and then began to sell it in China. Well, China started to step in and say, no, 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 the government, we don't want this to be here. But the British government didn't care what the Chinese government said. And they continued to supply this very addictive, very expensive drug to China. And as more of the drug flowed into China, less and less benefit was there for China. See, before this, the British would try to trade with China. Well, China, their products were top quality. They had the porcelain, they had the silk, they had, again, the rice flow and things like that. And all these things would go there. And Europe didn't really have anything that the Chinese wanted. So to make up the difference, let's say that the British, let's just pick something random. Let's say that they're bringing wood, all right, logs over. Well, they come and they want to sell the logs to China, and they want to trade them. We're going to trade you this ship full of wood, of lumber, for a ship full of silk. Well, the problem is the silk was worth more than the lumber was. So if the silk, and I'm just picking numbers to make it easy, if the silk was $100, the logs, the lumber was only worth $60. So the British traders, the merchants, would have to pay the extra $40 in silver, actual silver or gold, to make up the difference. Then they would get their silk and go back and be able to send it and to sell it for a profit, and they would repeat the process. Well, when opium came into the situation, all things started to change. The different Chinese groups and people could not get enough of opium. And so not only did they give the trade goods, silk and porcelain that I talked about, they started spending their own gold and silver on it as well. And so whereas cash had been flowing into China and making it strong and wealthy, cash was now leaving China and flowing into England, who may not have been a rival as warfare type of rival, but was a political rival in this realm, in this sphere here. And it began to strengthen England and weaken China. Well, that moves us right into actually talking about China. So go ahead and turn the page there. Now, back in the mid 1600s, the Manchu dynasty, they took over and controlled the situation there. They had thrown out the other dynasty that was there, and they ruled all the way up in some way, one way or another, until right before the beginning of World War One. The Manchu dynasty did. They increased trade, and they also increased trade with the West, but the more trading they did, the more interested the West became in the wealth and the land benefits of China, and so the decline of their own empire and kingdom became more and more difficult, or became more and more uh, extreme while it was there. China's resistance to change, though, ultimately led to the decline and the collapse of their government, because for China has a ancient history and ancestry and culture. And it's a beautiful culture. It's a wonderful culture. When the communists came in after World War II, they've destroyed a lot of it. And it's shameful what they've done. But what they have now, or what they did have, it was this wonderful culture that was there. And they liked their culture. They liked the way they did things. They did not want to have to change to be like the Europeans. But the problem was the Europeans did not care. And so they step in and they start making changes, whether the Chinese government or Chinese culture, Chinese people wanted to or not. And so they start making these changes. One of the changes that I've already mentioned is the opium problem. And these actually developed into a war between China and Britain. What happened was, for many, many years, the China had outlawed opium. Well, the British government and the British merchants didn't care about whether or not it's illegal to bring opium into China. If people are willing to pay for it, I'm going to sell it, was the British mindset. And so the British merchants would actually bribe the Chinese officials. They would bring a ship into port. The Chinese official would say, "Is there anything on the ship?" And the merchants, "Is there anything illegal? Is there any opium on the ship?" The merchants would say, "No, there is not." But there was. Like, the entire ship was nothing but opium. And they would give a bag of gold or silver to the merchant. And the merchant would say, "You're right, there isn't. Have a good day." And then they would sell the opium, and it would, again, continue to pollute the population and the culture of China. Well, eventually, the Chinese government finally tried to put an end to this. They're like, we're going to step up. We're going to get rid of these corrupt officials that are in charge here, and we're going to end it. We're going to stop this. Now, before I go in and develop a little bit more, I do want to mention something. I believe I mentioned, I don't remember, something about capitalism earlier in the video. And that's the way we have today. We talked about capitalism, one of the first videos that I made, about how when you generate a product, you get to keep the wealth that you helped create. Well, that is a way of doing a cultural economy. The cultural economy of Britain at this point in time, though, was something called mercantilism. Mercantilism was the idea that the more gold or silver a country owned, actual gold or silver that a country owned, the more powerful they were. The more stuff they had, the more powerful they were, and the more rich they were. And so this idea of mercantilism, again, remember how I mentioned that before the British had to spend silver in order to get the silk and the goods they wanted. Now it reversed, and the Chinese were giving silver to the British for the opium. And the British government did not want to lose that source of income. Even if they were getting it illegally by China's standards, they did not want to lose it. So when the Chinese government says no more, stop with this illegal activity, we're cutting it off, the British government steps in and says, no, you're not. You are not going to step in and do this. In 1842, the British forces, the British, like their merchants and even their navy, their military, step in, and China had closed their ports. Basically, had put up some navy ships, had put in some soldiers, and said, "We will not trade with British merchants anymore." Well, the British show up with warships and merchant ships loaded with the opium, and says, "You will open your ports, you will trade with us, or we will fire and we will kill you. We will destroy you." And China opened their ports. They didn't have a choice. They could not afford a war with England. So in 1842 they did that. There was fighting that took place there. In the Second Opium War that took place about 15, 20 years later, in the 1856 to 1860, the French actually joined the British in fighting against China. These wars eventually would break down the Manchu or the King dynasty that was there. And I believe I pronounced that wrong. Uh, that was there. Well, as these things happened, Britain and France started to get more and more control. More foreign influence was pouring into the nation of China. And some groups did not like this, understandably so. Some were more radical, were more willing to go through extreme processes to end the control of Britain and the French, to end the control of the foreign powers that were polluting in their mind, and I think rightfully so to a certain extent, destroying China. And so there was heavy taxation from the Qing dynasty, the government that went there. More and more people rebelled against this government because they saw them as just stooges and puppets of the British and the French, which at this point they were. Not only that, but there was heavy taxation. They were basically taking all this money from their people that were there. There was corruption in the government, and more people were having problems with this. Angry and hungry peasants began to revolt against government officials in small areas, but eventually some organized revolts would take place that resulted in some pretty major things here. There was one particular Chinese student that got tired of the corruption of the Chinese government and different things that happened. And interestingly, he called himself the Heavenly King, called himself that in Chinese. I'm not going to try to fully pronounce his name there. But even though he was going kind of in a revolt against the foreign powers that were there, part of his claim to being able to be in power, part of his claim for legitimacy, was that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. So we see how the foreign missionary work, how the foreign Christian, non-Chinese Christian things began to develop through there, and how it influenced his ideas and his mindsets there. Now, he believed that he was a chosen son of God. Now, not just as we understand as the children of God, somebody that gets saved, accepts salvation kind of thing there, but he actually believed he was a chosen son of God. And he had worked up, this was in between the First and the Second Opium Wars, he had gathered 10,000 peasant soldiers. Now, I specifically mean peasant soldiers. These were not trained military units. These were peasants who were tired of the corruption that they saw, and so they were in open revolt. And so they go through there and they saw how the first Opium War had weakened the government, and they were disgusted by it, so they went there. And what became known as the Taiping Rebellion actually lasted all the way up from shortly after, 9 years after the Opium War, the first one, all the way till after the end of the Second Opium War. Actually, part of the Second Opium War was a result of the Taiping Rebellion. because they were trying to stop all of this flooding opium and this destructive drug into their country. Eventually, though, their peasant army would grow to over 1 million people. Now, they wouldn't all be 1 million people in the same army marching across the countryside. It was spread out over China as word got around. They would go through here, and they were difficult to contain at first. That's why this rebellion lasted so long. But when the rebellion set up a government, when they set up a kind of a government and a capital in a place called Nanking, the British and the Chinese forces were able to destroy that central area there. Because an open guerrilla warfare is difficult to destroy because there's no centralized location. But in their mindset back then, in order to be legitimate, you had to set up a capital. Well, once you set up a capital, you have a place that can be destroyed and conquered. And for most countries, most warfare that take place in the world, once your capital is destroyed, the rebellion's over. And that's what happened with this rebellion here. Between the estimates, either from battle deaths from 1851 to 1864, battle deaths, starvations, massacres, disease, different deaths from injuries, it is estimated on the low end that 20 million people died during this rebellion. On the high end, 30 million people died. Well, that ended the revolt and the need for change for a generation. But every generation, when it comes back through, it doesn't remember or it has forgotten the pain and suffering that was there for the first time. And so in 1899, another rebellion develops. And this would become known as the Boxer Rebellion. Now, Boxer Rebellion, yes, actually, because of the way most of the fighters used traditional Chinese fighting methods, most of you would understand as like karate or kung fu, things like that. There's what would often be called shadow boxing, their use of martial arts. Now, did they actually use what we know of today as karate or kung fu? Most likely not. It was something similar to that, but it was a martial art there. And they saw this fighting style as the boxers. They were boxing, as they saw the fighting with the hand-to-hand combat and things like that. And they were officially known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, which is an awesome name. The Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. We are righteous and we are on the right path. We are doing what we're supposed to. Not only that, but we all agree to what we are doing and we are going to beat you if you disagree. It's just the name there, when you truly look at the name and figure it out, is an incredible name of power that they developed there. Well, this Boxer Rebellion was a Chinese society, an open rebellion against the Chinese government and the way they worked with the European powers, very similar to the Taiping Rebellion that took place there. Eventually, though, they realized, our fight is not against Chinese people. Our main fight is against Europeans. That's who we need to fight against. So eventually, this Boxer Rebellion, this group, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, would actually join up with the imperial empire and the imperial government for a time to better represent and push forward the Chinese interests. Because their problem wasn't with China. The Chinese, their problem was with the influence that the European powers gave. And one of the early months, the beginning of the rebellion, started with the Boxer Rebellion trying to push out any and all non-Chinese influence in China. And one place they started with was religion. Chinese Christians and Christian missionaries were told to leave, forced to leave, or simply murdered and massacred with this Boxer Rebellion there. Actually, in the northern areas, they very rarely, when I say they were asked to leave, it was not a, hey, you need to leave because we don't like you here. Often, they would come marauding into the communities and just start massacring people. They go through there. The Boxers would slaughter thousands of Chinese Christians because they saw them as traitors to traditional China. They wanted to remove all foreign influences. Now, I am not in any way, shape, or form condoning the way that the Boxer movement did this through murder and chaos. But when we begin to see how destructive and how terrible the European influences were to the Chinese culture, there is a little bit of sympathy there. The forced selling or the corrupt selling of opium, then the forcing the government to allow the powers to sell the opium. You begin to see some of the frustration that they have there. It's understandable what goes through. Eventually, what would develop here was that the European commanders said, you know what, we're going to send in a small force, about 430 men, 435 men to put down this rebellion. They soon realized that's not going to work. 49,000 soldiers, from 435 to 49,000 soldiers were eventually called up to put down this rebellion. And the problem was, as you have parts of the British government, or sorry, parts of the Chinese government, both during the Taiping Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion, that went to the foreign powers and asked for help. Now, in this particular time, some of the empire, some of the imperial government liked the Boxer Rebellion, but they couldn't openly endorse it. And so they had to ask for help to put it down. And so every time they ask a foreign power for military strength and help, they're giving more and more of their autonomy, more and more of their control over to to those foreign powers. The Chinese are losing it. So you not only have Britain that sends power here, but other major players in this area want control of China as well. You would have French, you would have Japanese, you would have Russian soldiers and armies go there. Even United States soldiers would go. And if not soldiers, then at least people that when this all was over, they would claim portions of China for their own overseas empire. The United States, Japan, France, Britain, and Russia were all part of this. You also, Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary went through here. There was an alliance of 8 different nations. Okay, you have 8 nations that are banded together out of the simple tenderness and sympathy for the Chinese government that they band together to help put down this Boxer rebellion. No, not at all. They're looking here, yes, they want to protect their own individuals and their own resources and citizens that are in China. But once this war is over, they're going to get a nice piece of that pie. And they want to make sure they get the biggest piece as possible. Eventually, you would have an emperor that would come to power that wanted to make some major sweeping changes to China. And they called them the 100 Days Reform. He wanted to make major reforms. But weirdly enough, he dies in suspicious circumstances, and his mom takes over as empress. These should be noted that these reforms were pretty anti-Chinese and pretty pro-European, non-Chinese policies that they have here. Then you would also, the different places here, as I mentioned, Japan was really coming into their own during this part here. Japan would take over part of China during this. Japan would take over the peninsula of Korea, both north and south there. You would have a war between China and Japan, where Japan just utterly whoops up and defeats the Chinese. The Sino-Japanese War that began there defeats the Manchu government, just completely humiliates them. And they take Taiwan and the island of Taiwan. They take the peninsula of Korea that is there. They also go through and they develop spheres of influence. In other words, places where different countries have control and power in China in this area here. You also would have different portions of Southeast Asia that get broken up. There's a wonderful map on page 300 that shows who controlled what. And actually, even all the way until recent years, America, the United States, has had a pretty close relationship with the Philippine Islands. And we still control, as part of our agreement during this section here, Guam, which is in that area there. Now, China was not the only one that would be forced to modernize. Japan would hold off for as long as they could as well. They actually had held off from the 1600s all the way till 1853. Now, remember, I want you to think about this here. 1853 is when Japan was opened to foreign trade, massive amounts of foreign trade there. And it was during the rebellion of the Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s that Japan was actually able to send they were a foreign invading power in China and able to go through and do this. Also, the Sino-Japanese War that took place there in 1894. So whereas China had been forced to open and forced to trade and make changes, they made the changes slowly and resisted. But once Japan's doors were open to the foreign world, they quickly realized if we do not modernize, we will get destroyed. We will get wiped off the map. They will take over our islands, and we will have no control over what happens there. But how did those doors get open? This here is, I would say, one of the black spots on American society, on American history. You can look at it two different ways. As an imperialist American, you look at this as any regular American. You can look at this and say, actually, that's pretty awesome. That's pretty sweet that America did that and took over and people listened that way. And hey, look at what happened. Japan modernized. Yeah, we had a big problem with Japan during World War II, but look at how successful they are now. And if it hadn't been for what took place in 1853, they probably wouldn't be there. There's that opinion in the American mindset. There's the other opinion that Americans should realize is that what happened here was the violation of governmental and autonomous rights of a people, where a bigger imperial power stepped in and said, we are going to do what we want, and we don't care what you want to do. You are going to listen to us. America was the imperial invader at this point that took place here. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry, Commodore means that he was in charge of a massive fleet, usually, of the United States Navy. It says that they visited the islands of Japan. Well, up to this point, the Japanese culture and islands had been restricted to very small ports. That if you wanted the outside culture, the trade had been restricted to small ports. If you wanted to trade, you had to trade there. You had to do it the way the Japanese wanted, and most of the time, it was only traded through in certain countries. Not just anybody could go and sail in there and do it. And so the Commodore Perry sails there and says, "Hey, I would like to open trade with you." And the Japanese fleet was there, but the problem was the American fleet was better. Now, in the book, it simply says that Matthew Perry visited Japan with his fleet, pressured the Japanese to open trade, and in 1854, the Japanese and the Americans, the United States, signed a trade agreement. That's super, super clean way of saying it. He sails into their harbors, opens the gun ports on his ships, and says, very similar to the British did during the Opium Wars, you will trade with us or we will start blasting our cannons, is what he did there. And Japan, realizing they could not resist, capitulated. They said, okay, we'll do that. In 1853, the Commodore Perry did that. Like I said, 1854, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, a trade agreement between them. Was this, in the long run, beneficial for both parties? Yes. Was this the right way to do this? Most certainly not. Well, as they go through there and begin modernizing, one of the systems that Perry had actually brought with him, Commodore Perry brought with him on the ships, was the telegraph system. And they could send messages from one town to another. They went and had brought the resources to actually build train tracks from certain different areas there. And they realized that if we do not quickly, the Japanese realized if we do not quickly modernize, we are going to fall behind, and it's going to be dangerous for us. And so the Western ideas came through there, and other countries came through. The United States were doing these things. They adopted a Western way of life. They built factories. They sent young men to the United States and Europe to learn and get trained in American policies and products. They sent them to Europe to learn how they had been doing it, and then brought those men back to institute in Japan to make those changes as well. And again, the thing was beneficial for Japan, but it was difficult also. In 1868, this was 15 years after Commodore Perry opened up, there was the title known as the Meiji, that the Enlightened Rule was came in there, and there was this emperor called himself the Enlightened Ruler. He said that he was going through, and it was called the Meiji Restoration. That he was going to lead this revival, and it's not really a revival. He's going to lead this growth in Japan. Japan actually became the first Asian country to be industrialized. Now, the European powers didn't want the other countries to be industrialized. Because when you have an industrialized country, you have a country that has a workforce, that has intellect, and I'm not saying that they weren't smart, but on a European mindset. They would have intellect, they would have learning, they would have education. Eventually, they'd be developing their own military, and they could throw off the yoke of bondage that the European powers put on them. That's why India and China at this point in history in the book, they weren't industrialized. Raw materials were being taken from the countries and sent back to the homelands, back to the mother countries that were there. But Japan industrializes itself, and they also develop a modern education and judicial system, the government system that was there. They no longer went from a feudal military that when they needed an army, they called upon peasants or people who had trained a couple of times a year. No, they had a modern navy. They had a modern army that was there. They lacked, unfortunately, raw materials such as coal and iron ore to make things, but they were able to quickly trade with other nations around them to get the supplies they needed. And they went through there and they were able to supply warships and well armed, well trained troops, thousands of troops, to help suppress the Boxer Rebellion that took place in China in the early 1900s. In 1904, 1905, Japan really goes and actually embarrasses a major world power. There is in 1904, 1905, there is the Russo-Japanese War. Many people see this as kind of a precursor for a lot of the modern military uh, things that will be used, the military might and weapons that will be used in World War One. But the Japanese go and utterly whoop up both the navy and the land armies of the Russian empire that's there, completely embarrassing them. This war would force the world to realize that Japan is not just some, young little upstart. Hey, look what they got, guys. Look, aren't they so cute? No, they just beat a world power, a world empire. That's a big deal that they would have there. And that lays the groundwork and sets the stage to enter into the next chapter of World War One, which we will begin the next video. Have a good day.